Welcome in, everyone. We have a very important topic to talk about today that involves Trump, the United States, our military, the Russians, the Ukrainians, foreign policy. You see a lot of nonsense floating around the internet right now about what might be true, what might be going on. Is there some deal that's going to be reached in Ukraine? And most of all, how should Americans be looking at the Russians and Russian leader Vladimir Putin? We're going to get into all that and more. This one is going to get spicy. Some people might not like it very much, might trigger some people, but we're here to tell people the truth. We're not here to make you feel good about whatever pre-existing views you might have. Before we get into it, as always, please make sure to like and subscribe. Comment with your thoughts below. Let me know what you think about the Russians, Trump, and everything. So right now, there are a lot of discussions underway about how to potentially bring the war in Ukraine to an end. Of course, the war started in 2022 when the Russians invaded into eastern Ukraine. It's been an absolute horrific situation. Lots of people are dead. Lots of people are injured. We actually don't even know the full numbers. You see both the Russians and the Ukrainians claim their losses are relatively low, while claiming the other side's losses are huge. I believe Trump has put Russian losses maybe as high as 800,000 to 1 million. I believe the Ukrainian losses he suggested could be somewhere in the ballpark of 500,000. It is the biggest war in Europe since World War II. And there's been a lot of momentum, a lot of movement to bring this to the end. We just saw Marco Rubio meet with Lavrov, the Russian counterpart in Saudi Arabia. He suggested that maybe as part of a peace deal, there'd be some economic cooperation, maybe some deals and partnership on other projects to incentivize the Russians to come to the table. The Russians have said that they're not interested really with negotiating with the rest of Europe if Europe wants to continue the fighting. The United States and President Trump have taken their own hardline stance on Ukraine, urging Zelensky to come to the table. Zelensky has said he's not accepting any deal that Ukraine is not a part of that's negotiated by the Russians and the Americans. So it's a mess. And one thing I want to talk about today, the biggest question that people are debating online is whether or not the Russians can be trusted. And two things can be true at once. Number one, the United States has given a fortune in economic and military aid to the Ukrainians. Whether you like that or you hate that, that is a fact. Some of that money has been given in cash. We've subsidized their pension system. A lot of it's been given in military equipment. The argument for that is, well, the equipment's made and bought here in the U.S., so really the money's going back into the U.S. The counter argument is this is just prolonging a war that is already lost, and we can debate that till we're blue in the face. But that's point number one. There's no debate and no question that the United States of America has given bags of cash or the equivalent of it in weapons and arms to the Ukrainians. Has there been enough proper oversight? I would argue probably not. Zelensky himself has said that they don't really know where all this guaranteed aid went. We hear stories about Ukrainians leaving the country, living high on the hog, and yet people are being sent into a meat grinder. So that's number one. We have written a blank check, essentially, for the better part of 3 years to the Ukrainians. But now let's talk about point two. Can the Russians actually be trusted? There seems to be this very weird streak of people on social media, not so much really in politics, but certainly on social media, who seem to be under the impression that everything Vladimir Putin says is true and he can be trusted and whatever he argues is correct and whatever the Russian narrative is 100% correct, and that's what we have to go with. And that, I have to tell you, is insanity. The question about whether or not the Russians can be trusted can be answered very simply. And the answer is absolutely not. The Russians cannot be trusted. If you go back in history over decades, post-World War II, there are countless examples of the Russians lying, cheating, stealing, and manipulating their way to what they want. And they will lie and twist things for as long as they think they can get away with it. The Cuban Missile Crisis. They lied about having nuclear weapons in Cuba until the evidence was so overwhelming that they no longer could do it. And then obviously we put up a blockade, came very close to nuclear war. And that's just one example. Look at the way the Soviets behaved in Berlin before the wall fell. Everything they did was a lie. The narratives they set up were a lie. The invasion of Georgia, they lied about that going into it. Taking Crimea, they lied about whether or not Russian troops were there. They lied prior to the invasion of Ukraine. These people cannot be trusted. Doesn't matter if it's Putin, Gorbachev, Yeltsin, any one of them cannot be trusted. It is the Russian way to be as deceitful as possible to get what you want. Say one thing publicly, don't watch what the other hand's doing behind our back. So if you think for 1 second that the Russians have the purest of intentions, then you haven't read history. Now, some people will argue that the United States promised at the fall of the Soviet Union that NATO would not expand. That was when George H.W. Bush was president. To be clear, there's no confirmed record of that. Furthermore, the presidency of the United States can switch every 4 years. One administration promising something that's not in a treaty ratified by the Senate, but is in a backroom handshake deal, does not mean that the next administration is required to honor that deal. That's the way politics work. The Russians know that's how we operate. The Chinese know that's how we operate. NATO knows that's how we operate. Now, I'm not here to argue whether or not the expansion of NATO is positive. I will say this. Poland, who was added after that into NATO, has been arguably the most useful NATO ally we have. They're the one country in Europe who doesn't actually seem to mind spending on their defense and is actually ready to fight if called upon. The Brits, they've got a mixed history. They've got some great guys. The SAS, love those guys. But if you think that everything the Americans are saying is untrue, but we can go trust the Russians, then I frankly don't know what reality you're living in. Putin is a former KGB officer. He has a KGB mindset. The KGB mindset is that the ends will always justify the means. We can do whatever we want to whoever we want as long as we get our way in the end. It was worth it. That's who we're dealing with. Let's be open and clear about that. The Russians are not saints. I would not trust them as far as you can throw them. Doesn't mean that we haven't given money to Ukraine without proper oversight. Doesn't mean that the situation with Ukraine couldn't have been handled better. Two things can be true at the same time. I am perplexed by all these people who seem to think that Putin would never lie, when all we have over the course of history is lie after lie after lie. Let's look at the Chechen wars. Putin lied about actions, I don't even know if I'm allowed to say them on YouTube, to justify that war. That's who he is. So anyone who thinks that now all of a sudden Putin is pure, honest, and clean, I don't know what to tell you. Because the reality of the situation is history tells us the Russians cannot be trusted. And they will screw you over at the first possible opportunity. So be very careful, tread very carefully when it comes to trusting the Russians. And by that, I mean don't trust them. Trust but verify is the saying from Reagan used to be. The Russian government is essentially a gangster state run on oil and gas exports. That's what it is. It's a poor country with a lot of nuclear weapons and a military that has failed to take Ukraine. They, in many ways, have turned out to be a paper tiger. Doesn't mean they're not a threat. They're absolutely a threat. What it does mean is all the bluffing and all the buildup we've heard about the great Russian military, I believe they've made 10 fifth-generation fighter jets. It's unclear if any of them work. The United States has thousands. These people are not who they want you to believe they are, but they are liars. And so I encourage everyone who hears Putin say something to actually question whether or not he should be taken at face value. The answer is absolutely not. But I want to hear your thoughts. Let me know in the comments whether or not you think the Trump administration can trust the Russians, or if you agree with my assessment that the Russians will screw over and stab anyone in the back at the first possible opportunity. If you made it this far, obviously make sure to like and subscribe. I'll catch y'all next time.